So in the two podcasts, we really talked about what life was like for Black women before emancipation. We also delved into the topic of, Black women and white women and having affairs and how that was kind of different along class lines. It wasn't a problem when Black men and poor white women had relationships, at least not unless there was a child born from that. But an elite white woman and a Black man, it became an issue because now you're challenging the Southern ideal of chastity and honor. So we understand that after the Civil War, this changes. Emancipation changes. Whites were the owners during slavery, blacks were the slaves. With emancipation, this changes. There's not a division between slave and master. So again, the white Southerners go through some sort of identity crisis. So how are they going to maintain this superiority when slave and master no longer exist? So the way in which the white male Southerner would maintain control was to create something called the Black Rapist myth. The white Southerner needed to demonize blacks and make the rest of the country believe that blacks were unable to operate in polite society, and certainly they were not equal to whites. White Southerners really saw the entrance of blacks into society as socially, as sexually, as politically dangerous. So, there were specific ways in which white Southerners portrayed this Black Rapist myth. First, Black women were still regarded as promiscuous, much like they were before the Civil War. They were also viewed as refusing to succumb to gendered family roles. Usually the man is the breadwinner and the woman is the one, she's in her sphere, domestic sphere. That was the proper gendered family role that the Southern society was used to. But Black women worked outside the home. They spoke and participated socially outside the home. White on black rape occurred, and it was used as a form of control of white men over black women. And again, the white men did not view this as rape, as they viewed black women as, naturally promiscuous, and so of course they're not going to be able to refuse. Black men were negatively portrayed by white men, not just because of political and social reasons, but also because they were seen as unable to control their home and defend their women who were being raped. So basically the rhetoric states that blacks were incapable of being productive citizens who could follow societal norms, therefore were not worthy of their freedom. So this kind of propaganda, it spreads through white politicians, of course, and also through conservative newspapers. You can see these are a couple newspaper headlines, where they're focusing on black sexuality, and this black rapist myth, you can see, is really permeating after 1870 through the 1950s, really. So in order to convince people that black men were barbaric and were not able to coexist in this polite society, some way to control black men was created. This was the myth. This is the birth of the myth of the black rapist. So white Southerners created this myth in order to convince others of their barbaric nature of the black race. So during the process of emancipation, when there was a sort of chaos surrounding the South, historians can find absolutely no records of black men raping women. It simply doesn't exist. White Southerners, probably from the fear of violence that ensued after the Haiti Revolution, they thought that possibly this same violence by blacks would occur. It didn't occur. If there actually were cases of black men raping women, we would know about it. We would know about it from court records and from we know about it from newspaper articles. This would have been heavily sensationalized. There's no way we wouldn't have known about this. So unlike before the Civil War, when blacks were defended by their masters, black and white rape accusations were viewed much differently now, post-emancipation. No longer is it going to be divided by class. Poor white women are now viewed as promiscuous, but rather if they are Southern white women, they could also enjoy this kind of Southern honor that elite white women had enjoyed before the Civil War. From this black rape myth stems justifications for lynchings, which I'm sure you've heard about. And these two maps show the lynchings that really occur 1877 to 1950. And it shows, how many lynchings occurred in the various southern states. This one's done by county, so you can see the clustering of this, and this one is done just by shading and the number of victims by this. So, again, Southern white women, poor Southern white women began to enjoy this kind of Southern honor that elite white women had enjoyed before the Civil War. But, of course, this black rapist myth stems from this. Okay, so the lynchings, again, they don't begin until after emancipation. There weren't any lynchings before this. Some of the records indicate that there were about 4,000 lynchings that occurred between 1870 and 1950. And some of these, or most of these, really, most of them were because of false rape charges. The NAACP actually defines lynchings, if you're wondering. It's not just hangings. So the NAACP defines lynchings as any kind of illegal killing by a group of 3 or more. And the numbers might actually have been higher because they get information from historic newspapers. Not every newspaper is going to report a lynching. Sometimes that was hidden, particularly if they knew that something was wrong. There was a very famous case that I did a little bit with one of my graduate classes in, a case, the Scottsboro case, and some of you may be familiar with this case anyway, but it really relates to this myth. For those of you that are not familiar, just a real quick summary on this case. 9 black men, they were falsely accused of raping 2 poor white women. The incident occurred on a train and a fight broke out between a group of poor white men and 9 black men. So the women that were accused, the 9 men, again were 2 poor white women. One of them recanted, by the way, years later, and one held to her story. But anyway, this really shows how the role of poor white women had really changed and metamorphosized after emancipation. Poor white women were not viewed as promiscuous anymore, but as holding the same kind of honor as elite white women did. So there's a lot more to this story of Scottsboro. I won't go into the great detail of the story, but the accusation itself, but it actually went all the way to the Supreme Court. It included the Communist Party and the NAACP. But again, the accusation itself should really illustrate the treatment and how this black rapist myth really permeated throughout society in the late 19th and the early 20th century to the mid 20th century at that. So another way to see this black rapist myth, you can see through historical fiction. The most famous of these that I'm sure you all are familiar with is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. It was written in 1961. So in this story, it took place in 1932 Alabama. Tom Robinson is a black man falsely accused of raping a poor white woman. And this is Gregory Peck, and I don't know who this gentleman is. That's representing Tom Robinson in this case. But of course, this is the famous movie that was done in To Kill a Mockingbird. But the town actually that Harper Lee wrote about in this book was modeled after her own hometown in Alabama. And she designed it to reflect the same kind of racial tensions and the black rapist myths that were ingrained in society of the South during this time period. So even though it's fiction, it still sheds light on the issues society was facing during that time period. And it also highlights the control white Southerners still tried to maintain on African Americans even after emancipation. By the way, I think she wrote a follow-up book too, which is why I think it's so popular too right now. Okay, and I think we're going to do, actually I think we've got just a little bit more here. So sum it up really, post-emancipation, poor white women's status was somewhat elevated. They're no longer seen as promiscuous, as having the same kind of Southern honor and chastity that elite white women in the South enjoyed. This in no way means that the white women were on an even playing field as white men. Patriarchy was still strong, particularly in the South, and women were really relegated to their own sphere, the domestic sphere, as I talked about before. But my main focus in this portion of the podcast was really to show how the roles changed for poor white women and how this myth of the black rapist was really formed out of fear in a way to control African Americans after emancipation. White Southerners could control blacks during slavery, and this myth created of African Americans post-Civil War was a way really to control them and to assure that white supremacy would still exist. So to really sum up the entire podcast, we can see how the lives of black women and men changed after emancipation. Not particularly for the better, maybe not as bad as being subjugated as slaves, but certainly they did not enjoy the same amount of citizenship rights as whites. Before the Civil War, poor white women lacked honor and were seen as very promiscuous. When accusations of black on white rape existed, slave owners hired lawyers and they defended their property. But again, it was purely for economic reasons. This changes after emancipation when white Southerners need to find some way to maintain the control they enjoyed, prior to emancipation and to keep their supremacy intact. They did this through the myth of the black rapist. Also, I hope you understand after this podcast the origin of this black rapist myth. I would love to say that this is completely non-existent in today's society, but unfortunately, remnants of this myth we can still see today. We can see it in our current climate and the tension in race relations, but also I was reading a study and it actually said that 93% of sexual assaults are actually intraracial, not interracial. So intra, I-N-T-R-A. So if a white woman is raped, there's a 93% chance it was a white man. Of course, society only highlights the other 7%. Unfortunately, this myth still exists. But hopefully now you're a little more schooled on where this myth came from, how it permeated, and how the roles of black and white women really changed after emancipation.